Yeah, we haven't met since I've come to Bangalore, but we have met in Bombay at this.
And this, yeah.
Shall we start?
Yeah, I think it's time is. This may join it, so we can start, I think.
Okay. Welcome to this session of ClimatexSummit, the Global Youth Summit on Net Zero Future and the third graduate forum of the Global Alliance of Universities and Climate. So Global Alliance of Universities of Climate is 15 universities all around the world, and Indian Institute of Science is part of it.
Recording in progress.
I'm Shoibal Chakravarti, and I'm a visiting professor at the Devecha Center for Climate Change, and this panel is being hosted by the Devecha Center for Climate Change. Today's panel is titled India's Interim Climate Policy, Preparing for Net Zero. As we all know, in the Paris COP, we as a world agreed to avoid dangerous global warming, and that translates to trying to avoid going above 1.5 degrees of warming. And the IPCC Special Report on global warming of 1.5 degrees recommended that that's equivalent to lowering our emissions to zero by 2050, or approximately emitting at the most another 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So that's what this panel is about. What does this mean for India and the developing world? How do India and other developing countries balance their development and climate challenges simultaneously? So this panel will discuss the climate policies, climate institutions, and climate diplomacy initiatives that India and the developing world would need to prepare for a global net zero target. Let me introduce the panelists briefly. Professor Tejal Kanatkar is at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. She will speak on India's position on the global net zero target. Professor Navroz Dubash is at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, and he will speak about climate policy architectures and institutions. Professor Somanathan is at the Indian Statistical Institute, New Delhi. He's going to talk a bit about the Global Climate Incentive. Professor J. Srinivasan, Emeritus Professor at Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and Founding Director of the Devecha Center, is our moderator and discussant. I will speak on India's near-term climate policies. So let's start with Professor Tejal Kanatkar.
Thank you, Shoibal. Let me just share my screen. So, I mean, Shoibal introduced the entire concept of net zero and what it means. There seem to be a flurry of declarations on net zero that are coming in as we head towards COP26. We have, there is a lot of pressure building on multiple countries to declare net zero. What does this net zero target mean? I mean, it is going, your net emissions should go to zero. That means that as much emissions, anthropogenic emissions, as you emit, there must be methods that you employ to actually absorb those emissions or reduce those many emissions from the atmosphere. That is what net zero implies. So there seems to be a lot of focus here, and net zero does find a mention. Net zero emissions targets do find a mention in the Paris Agreement as well, but they are supposed to be. It's supposed to be a global net zero target. It is not meant to apply to individual countries in that same form. So what does it mean? And what does the IPCC report say? So the IPCC report doesn't actually say that you can either reach net zero by 2050 or limit emissions to 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. What the IPCC report very clearly says is that while net zero is a condition, a precondition, a requirement, not a precondition, a requirement to limit temperature rise to any limit. So you might want to limit temperature rise from pre-industrial levels to 5 degrees Celsius, and you would still have to go to net zero at some point of time. But the key determinant of this temperature rise is the amount of cumulative emissions implied by how you get from where you are today, where the world is today, to net zero. And so it is this global carbon budget that is really the determinant, the key determinant. And so when the world reaches net zero is essentially flexible, as long as the cumulative emissions implied by that trajectory of reaching net zero is limited within a specified carbon budget. And Schreiber mentioned 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. That is equivalent, that is the remaining carbon budget, what is remaining from 2020 onwards till the world reaches net zero, to limit temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius with a 50% probability as per the latest IPCC report. And so what I mean by this flexibility is this. So if you actually have a linear reduction, we are at about close to 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent without fluoride in 2019. If we start reducing the world as a whole, what I mean by we here is the world as a whole, starts reducing emissions and goes rapidly to net zero emissions by 2050, then there are certain, the area under this particular curve is the total cumulative emissions. And what we will end up emitting is about 730 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Give or take, some of this might be absorbed by UCF land use and land use change and forestry emissions. However, let's assume that we have 730 gigatons of carbon dioxide. This corresponds to about 2/3 probability of exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius. It will lead to a very good chance that we limit temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius. But even this, reaching net zero linearly by 2050, will not give us a very good chance of limiting temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees. Alternatively, what we can do is this particular emissions trajectory also has the same cumulative emissions. Here what we are doing is reducing, front-loading emissions reduction. So there's a rapid reduction in emissions initially, and which then tapers off with a long tail going to net zero by 2100, not 2050. The cumulative emissions implied by this particular trajectory is the same. It's 730 gigatons of carbon dioxide with the same probabilities for 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So therefore, why I wanted to show this illustration is to say that this particular trajectory of rapid reductions initially and then sort of tapering off is what we would prefer, because that then leaves, that long tail leaves some flexibility for developing countries, for poorer countries who do not have the means to undertake high levels of mitigation today or have a huge developmental deficit like India, to be able to use the resources that they can to then get to a particular point from where reductions become easier, cheaper, and more reasonably possible to undertake. Front-loading of global emissions reductions would be possible only if the Annex 1, that is the developed countries in the UNFCCC language, the Annex 1 countries, if they reduce their emissions rapidly now, then they allow developing countries more time and more flexibility to do so later. However, if you look at the current NDCs, the enhanced NDCs as they call them, by the developed countries, and these the long-term LTS, the long-term targets that they have given, Not all of them have submitted official targets for net zero for 2050. Some of them have them in their local domestic policy documents. But what these imply is a backloading of reductions. They're pushing reductions much more into the future, and this is the rich countries that are pushing these emissions reductions into the future. And what this would mean is that the US, EU, this includes the UK, EU plus EU 27 plus UK, and China together will emit about 600 gigatons of CO2 at least between 2020 and the declared nets. The budget for a 50% probability is 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So just these three regions together will emit much more than what is required for 1.5, leaving no space. And so therefore, the pressure is for developed countries to undertake this, to start reducing now. There's pressure on every country to start declaring net zero targets, to start reducing now, enhance your mitigation reduction targets, so that this trajectory, the blue line that we see, is achieved by developing country reductions. And this space that is available then is available again for developed countries who have historically emitted much more, is available for them to free ride on developing country mitigation measures. So in this context, I would like to submit that on the net zero, the entire hullabaloo about net zero, this narrative needs to be called out. It is inadequate, if not a false narrative. And therefore, I think that India must not declare a net zero target. Developed countries, in fact, must declare what the cumulative emissions are going to be, what their targets imply, the cumulative emissions would be. India, that doesn't mean India must not do anything. India must do what it can domestically, but it should not compensate for the free riding by developed countries, because this is exactly what is happening now. Pressure on developing countries to mitigate, and the constant pushing forward of mitigation targets by developed countries. Earlier said 2012 for Kyoto, then 2020. Now none of that wants to be discussed. We are talking about 2050, which is 30 years into the future. So when we talk about climate ambition, and unfortunately what has happened is a huge number of trackers of indices that measure whether action is adequate or not, and you have a whole slew of these coming up just before a COP to build up pressure. Unfortunately, do not measure action on the basis of what is an equitable effort that goes into climate change mitigation. They do so only in terms of, what are the costs and a whole lot of other things, but I won't go into that right now. So what India's position must be is that climate ambition must be measured on the basis of equity. And the question, the challenge domestically for us really is how we can achieve higher levels of development within our fair share of the carbon budget. How can India do this? Unlike developed countries who have overconsumed their fair share. We don't have the same luxury. We cannot consume more than our fair share, but we should not give up the right to our fair share. And so the developmental challenge for us is huge. We have low development, low energy, low emissions. It's the very basic classification, but it doesn't just classify countries based on GDP. This classification is based on multiple developmental parameters, equity, infant mortality, etc., etc. And so this is a three-way classification of high development, medium development, and low development. This is where India is. If you look at per capita energy use, there is a significant difference across India. We might not want to go to 338, the levels of the US, but there is no doubt, because all of the developmental indicators are correlated positively with energy. I'm not even talking about emissions. So if we want to increase access to energy services, make sure that we have enough investment in infrastructure to allow for this, then energy use per capita has to increase, and increase to some level at least. Perhaps not, we may not need the same levels of energy use as developed countries, but we cannot do it with these levels of energy use. And so therefore, we need to be able to have a position, India's position in response to this entire net zero pressure needs to be based on an understanding of its developmental requirements. It's extremely important now because, as I've said, it's just the 3 highest emitters are going to consume more than the 1.5 degrees Celsius budget. So we are looking at a world which is greater than 1.5 degrees Celsius, and so we need to ensure that we invest enough in development, because that is really our first safeguard against climate change. For adaptation, that is what we need to do: increased resilience of our people to be able to do this. And we should, like I said, we should do what we must, but there is a cost involved in mitigation. To claim that there is no cost, in my opinion, would be incorrect. There is a cost. The southern states, and just the southern states, are paying quite significantly, every year to absorb higher levels of renewable energy today. And so it is still costly. I mean, there has been a lot of reduction in costs globally, but this is currently still leads to a total cost on the Indian energy system. So India's energy options are also limited. We don't have natural gas. The transition in developed countries has been to natural gas. Just today, there has been a statement from an African leader saying that this is really what is happening. The pressure to stop fossil fuel use, the moratorium on funding for fossil fuel projects is really going to hurt development in Africa, because there is, if there are no options like the developed countries had of natural gas or nuclear for that matter, what is it that countries in the global south do? And so this becomes really an important question. I think I have overshot my time, so I'll stop here, and perhaps then we can have a discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Teju. Now I will hand the podium to Navroz.
Thank you so much, Shorbal. It's very good to be part of this group with Professor Srinivasan and Som, Tejal, and yourself. Shorbal, you asked me to talk about institutional issues in climate, institutions, and so on. But before that, I'm just going to sort of pick up from where Tejal left off and talk about a little bit about what it is that these institutions should really be trying to do. Right? So we can't really talk about institutions and policies without beginning with what the objective is. And Tejal's presentation is a good sort of kickoff point for that. I broadly agree with a lot of what Tejal said in terms of the risks to India of kind of prematurely coming up with a net zero target. I just don't think that we know enough to know whether trying to achieve a net zero target, certainly by 2050, will place the cost of the transition on the back of India's poor. And that's just not tenable. It is true that that mitigation in some aspects is costly, as Tejal said, but it is also true that mitigation brings a lot of co-benefits. Are the co-benefits sufficient that we can deal with India's poverty problem? Nobody knows the answer to that. So jumping ahead in a sense and coming up with a net zero target could be risky for India. But the other part of this is to say that India has a strong interest in accelerating global mitigation, but I'm not entirely convinced that net zero targets actually drive that to the extent that they're touted to. Partly because they lead to countries talking about what they will do 30 years from now, in the case of China, 40 years from now. Whereas what we really need is, as Tejal was saying, to front load action. So that front loading of action, I think collectively is what we want. Now, what is it that India needs to do given all of this? Obviously, we need to do mitigation consistent with our development needs, and we need to both act ourselves and encourage the world to focus on near-term actions. And in a country like India that is still growing rapidly, GDP is growing, we're going through a demographic transition, an urbanization transition, we have the possibility of avoiding locking into high carbon infrastructure, high carbon behavioral decisions, and so on, right? So the more we do upfront, in fact, the potential exists, at least for us, to be more competitive in the global economy, because we will be actually putting in place technologies and infrastructures that are now being developed and where industrialized countries are actually replacing their infrastructures to go down this road. So it's renewable energy technologies, but also public transport systems and so on and so forth. So we really need to be thinking about how the Indian economy and society can transition to a low carbon future. But that transition is best thought of not as a single large economy-wide kind of net zero construct, but more as a series of sectoral transitions. How do we decarbonize electricity? How do we make our urbanization process more sustainable? How do we make our freight system more rail rather than road-based, more low carbon? How do we think about industrialization in the future and job creation in ways that are at least primed for future technologies that might be low carbon? So we have to think about these sector by sector transitions, right? So now when I come to institutions, it's institutions and legal processes that allows India to bring together our development imperatives with a vision of a low carbon future. Those are the kinds of institutions that we need, right? So what do those look like? So I'm going to sort of spell it out in 2 or 3 ways. One is, I think that it would be extremely useful at this stage for India to have a legal framework that lays the basis for this low carbon transition. And why is a legal framework important? Well, because too often, and the way in which our existing governance structures are set up, we are thinking about climate change as a subset of environmental issues. So, for example, in our what's called our conduct of business regulations within the government, which ministry takes charge of what? Climate is embedded within environment. But we all know climate change is about urbanization. It's about adaptation issues, so it takes you to agriculture. It's about decisions about the whole future of this economy. It basically covers, it's an all of economy problem, essentially, right? So we need a legal framework that spells out the fact that we need to be thinking about climate change in a way that internalizes climate considerations. And by that, I mean considerations that bring together climate and development across the board in certainly the central government, but also in interactions between the center and the states. So a legal framework sends that signal. Now, when many people hear the word climate law, they think that must be, some kind of net zero target, some quantitative target, followed by kind of a regulatory structure. But that's not necessarily the case. Many other countries, South Africa, for a while, South Korea with its Green Growth Act, Mexico, other countries had more facilitative legal frameworks that tried to mainstream climate change and induce ministries to think through the co-benefits, the trade-offs of bringing together mitigation and development. So that's the kind of legal construct we need. And the other thing the law can bring is it can put in place institutions whose responsibility it is to analyze and think about these things. Now, India is always a little bit late to the game at these COPs. We're still trying to figure out exactly what our position is if sort of rumors are to be believed. And in part, it's an institutional story. You can't place the burden of this only on the Ministry of Environment. It's a much bigger sort of question. So we need to have the institutions that allow us to think about these things. Shoaib, can you just give me a time check? How much time do I have? Shoaib? No? Okay, I'll just keep going.
You have another 6-7 minutes, I believe.
Okay, thanks. So that's sort of the legal framework. But the legal framework has to then actually embed within it key institutional elements, right? So the kind of elements that we've done some issue briefs at CPR. We've just had a webinar actually on climate law. So we've been trying to think about what this looks like. And what we are proposing, in a sense, and this is something that we have written about not just for India but for climate governance more generally, that there are 3 big climate governance tasks. One is strategy setting, right? So the vision of a low carbon future that brings together development and climate change requires analysis and debate and discussion with stakeholders in those sectors as to what the trajectory forward should be, right? So 10 years ago, India put in place its solar mission. And there was a decision made at the time to focus on utility scale, basically grid connected solar. There were other ideas out there at the time. People said, why don't we do solar hot water heaters, do decentralized solar, and so on and so forth. But there wasn't that much thinking paid, for example, to whether or not India's solar trajectory would also be a job creating trajectory. By comparison, China and to some extent South Africa took very different approaches, where they said, we are not going to focus on rapid deployment. We're going to focus on building manufacturing capacity, even if the deployment is a bit slower. So that's an example where perhaps we didn't think through the development choices that went into solar promotion. And it's those kinds of questions. How do you bring development and climate together that we need institutions to do? So, for example, we've mooted the idea of a low carbon development commission, which includes experts, but also representatives of labor organizations, media, representatives of coal affected states, and so on and so forth, to think about those sector by sector transitions in areas like decarbonizing electricity, in urbanization, in the transport sector, and so on. So the first is kind of a strategy setting role. We need a body to do that. The second is, one of the truisms of climate change is that the scale and scope of the transformation is so big that you are going to create losers, right? And so if we want to have a just society as well as a low carbon society, we have to have mechanisms where we think through transition and compensation plans, for example, for coal mining communities, if ultimately coal is to be phased out, if it's over 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, there will be a phase out of coal, almost certainly. How do we factor in the sorts of compensatory structures as well as new livelihoods for both workers and the communities that depend on them? So there is a deliberative and an engagement process that institutions have to put in place. South Africa, for example, is a very nice presidential commission on climate change where they bring together affected stakeholders of all sorts and try and kind of hammer out what would happen. In Germany, they have a history of corporatism where labor and government and the private sector sit together and is, in a sense, kind of bargain it out. So we have to think about how we do this because we also want a fair transition, not just a low carbon one. The third piece of this is a coordination piece. Because climate change cuts across so many ministries and areas of human endeavor, there has to be a coordinating structure at the governmental level, both at the central and the state governments. We have had coordinating committees in the past. We have something at the moment called the Executive Committee on Secretaries, but it is really kind of a high-level troubleshooting body. It's not a true coordinating body. So we need something that solves that problem. And the last piece of this is we need to have a climate governance system that speaks to Indian federalism. So we need to have a system where states are encouraged to experiment, for example, with climate resilient crops, or also states are encouraged to band together the Himalayan states, the coastal states, to come up with mechanisms for adaptation or to experiment with urbanization approaches and so on and so forth. And the role of the center there really has to be to provide the public goods, both intellectual public goods as well as financial incentives. So we need to build a structure at the federal level too for states. So these are so just to quickly summarize then, institutions for what? Institutions to bring together development and climate change in a way that mainstreams climate change, keeping in mind development objectives and justice. For that, we need an overarching legal framework that sets this out as an objective and creates enabling institutions. Those institutions need to perform roles of strategy setting, building consensus and coordination, as well as enabling climate change to be internalized in India's federal structure. So that's the way forward. It's a lot of ingredients, a lot of moving parts. But if we're serious about building the underlying institutional lattice for long-term climate action, that's what we should be thinking about. Shoaib, back to you.
Thank you, Navroz. That was a very lucid talk on what sort of institutions we need going forward. I think I will take over now and latch on to the first few minutes that you spent on the kind of sectoral policies that we have had in the past, and how do we move forward from this. Let's see. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to limit myself to what has worked in the past and what sort of policies we should continue, at least in the short term, the next 10, 15 years. So by and large, this overlaps a little bit with what Navroz said, what has been India's approach to policy making, and whether we can build a slightly more ambitious near-term climate policy based on what has worked so far. So by and large, India's approach, as pointed out, has been one of centralized policy making, and often ad hoc and often sectoral. So, and I would say that these policies by and large can be divided into three types. One where you have national targets, policies, and so new mechanisms are introduced to sort of meet those targets, and these get some sort of policy support. This has been seen, for example, in the case of LED bulbs or solar PV. A second set of strategies are about providing fiscal support for certain technologies. It's often in the form of budgetary support or subsidies. Again, a good example is solar PV and transmission expansion for the sake of renewables. A third set of strategies are about introducing new regulations, new standards. These have worked in the case of appliance ratings, for example, efficiency standards for appliances, then vehicular fuel efficiency standards, emission standards, and so on. And these, I would say, have worked fairly well, and we need to build on these, but in a more coherent framework, as Navroz has pointed out. So let me go sector by sector and looking at what has worked and how to go beyond that. The first is, of course, electricity sector and coal. The power sector is responsible for almost half of India's emissions. At the same time, the National Solar Mission and various, very ambitious targets for renewables expansion in the last decade or so have, I would say, dramatically changed at least India's power generating capacity. So right now we are almost at 40% of our generating capacity being non-fossil, and about a fifth of India's electricity generation is coming from non-fossil sources. And if our expansion plans proceed and are successful, then we are likely to see approximately 55 to 65% of India's electricity generating capacity is non-fossil by 2030. And the share of clean generation would more than double. So the reason for this, of course, is primarily the success of the dramatic reduction in the cost of renewable electricity, both as a result of technological change as well as a result of various policy decisions made at home. This is based on a work of recent work of mine. If we project would actually be fairly close to a new fossil fuel plant, a new coal plant actually. So effectively signaling that it doesn't really make much sense to build a new coal plant going forward. And in some sense, we are already seeing that there has been a large, significant slowdown in new coal capacity coming online in the last few years. The next thing I would look at is carbon taxes. Now, this might be surprising for a significant number of people that India actually has significant carbon taxes, though they are often implicit more than explicit. Our only explicit carbon tax is the clean energy cess on coal, which is about 400 rupees a ton, or approximately $3 to $4 a ton of carbon dioxide. But when one tags along transmission subsidies provided to renewables and the fact that rail freight of coal is the biggest source of rail freight, and this actually cross-subsidizes passenger traffic, then the implicit carbon tax is often significantly higher. And this already shows, I think more than half of India's coal has a running cost that is comparable to that of new renewables. The second thing I would point out is fuel tax on diesel and petrol. These actually are fairly high in India. In fact, comparable to tax on transportation fuels in Europe. The tax on petrol or diesel is approximately $200 or $300 per ton of CO2, significantly higher than, say, USA or China. And again, one can see the impact of this in the sales of EVs, especially 2- and 3-wheeler EVs. Now, these taxes that I'm referring to, especially the fuel tax, is significantly higher than what most models suggest is required for a decarbonization in the coming decades. What does this mean for the entire economy as a whole? About 60% of India's emissions were already taxed in 2018, and they have paid a tax of at least $4 to $5 a ton. If you look at transportation fuels, about 11–12% of India's emissions, these were taxed at a significantly higher rate. Approximately $200, $300 per ton of fuel. So this sort of underappreciated fact that India's effective carbon taxes actually already operate as a very stiff carbon tax and is already changing the way India uses fossil fuel energy. The next thing I would focus on happen to be our electric vehicle policies. Now, as pointed out, the cost of running 2- and 3-wheelers using internal combustion engines is likely significantly higher than electric vehicles. But electric vehicles have a higher purchase cost. And so these India's policies are effectively about providing an upfront subsidy to the purchase cost of 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. And significantly on 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers, much less so on 4-wheelers. What we find is that today, 3-wheelers or the autos that one sees in Indian cities are more economical than internal combustion engines, even without a subsidy. And with subsidies, most 2-wheelers, most electric 2-wheelers are again more affordable than internal combustion engines. In fact, if the current trend of decline in the cost of lithium batteries continue, and with the additional policy framework that's already there, we are likely to see more than a quarter to a third of India's new vehicles, new 2-wheelers, will be electric vehicles by 2030. Now, there's something simple that could possibly be tried, which is to mandate that all 2-wheelers by 2030 will be sold in the Indian market should be electric. And this, I believe, could set the kind of industrial policy and targets that would change the way the Indian automobile industry, as well as the nascent lithium battery manufacturing industry, would jumpstart in the country. And one thing to note is that India still has very low vehicular ownership, and 3/4 of the vehicles in the market on the roads are actually two-wheelers. So the success of this policy, as well as the success of the greening of the electricity grid, means that by the time Indians are actually rich enough to buy significant number of vehicles and afford to consume electricity at a higher rate, the Indian energy system would actually change to the point where the only vehicles that would be available in the Indian market would be electric vehicles, and the electricity that will be generated for consumption would also be mostly green. So this is in some sense, one could say is one of the benefits of the catch-up effect, where by the time Indians are rich enough to consume significantly, the sources of energy and the kind of consumption they would do would be significantly greener than those who developed a few decades ago. Another thing that Navroz mentioned was transportation and freight. Now, the single biggest source of transportation emissions in India happens to be diesel trucks. Something like 40% of India's transportation emissions come from trucks. And if we manage to move a significant part of this freight back to rail, and we can significantly reduce cumulative emissions in the next coming decades. And we are moving in this direction. The entire railway network in India has been electrified, will be electrified in a couple of years. And we are building dedicated freight corridors where freight can travel at significantly higher speeds and need not share rail network with passenger rail. I think in a decade or so, India's freight transportation would be significantly greener and would possibly save tens of gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions in the coming years. The other major source of increasing emissions in India happens to be residential electricity consumption. In fact, it is the fastest growing category of electricity consumption in the country. And improving appliance efficiency via regulatory policies happens to be the fastest and the most efficient way of controlling additional emissions that are going to come from this category of emissions, from this category of consumption. In fact, as India warms and gets richer, the demand for space cooling in the form of air conditioning and cooling will grow exponentially. In fact, the IEA projects that in a few decades, India's space cooling needs would be comparable to today's entire electricity generation. And so improving efficiency in this category of appliances will make a significant difference to India's energy consumption. In fact, as early as 2027, India's electricity consumption could be lowered by 5 to 10% if we improve the efficiency of our air conditioners. And India has already had a successful program to replace incandescent lamps with LEDs and CFLs, and it is estimated that this reduces evening peak demand by something like 10 gigawatts. So what's left? This is the more difficult part, the industrial sector. Cement, steel, fertilizers, and chemicals. The four big core industries contribute about 80% of India's emissions, industrial emissions, and these are likely to grow by at least a factor of 2 or 3 in the next decades. Now, at least in some categories, the high cost of energy has already made India's industrial sectors very efficient. For example, India's cement sector is among the most efficient in the world. We have had a set of policies called Perform, Achieve, and Trade, which incentivize industries to meet efficiency targets and then let them trade efficiency certificates. And this has led to quite a few improvements in energy efficiency and emissions of different industrial sectors. Now, in the long term, of course, India's industrial energy use challenges remain comparable to the rest of the world, and that sort of decarbonization on hard to abate sectors can change only when significant revolutionary change happens. And one of these is, of course, electrification of industrial energy use to the extent possible. A second one, of course, is using hydrogen as a feedstock. And so the newly launched National Hydrogen Mission is a step in this direction, and you can possibly expect in a few decades, for example, India's steel industry to move towards use of hydrogen for steel manufacturing instead of carbon. So, as I said, these various sectoral policies have achieved significant success and are likely to actually increase the pace at which emissions and emissions intensity of the Indian GDP reduce in the next decade or so. So what does this mean for India's NDCs and going forward? So I'll focus on two of India's 3 NDCs where we have actually achieved significant progress. First is 40% non-fossil share of electricity by 2030. In fact, I believe we will achieve it this year or latest by next year. The second NDC that India promised was about 30 to 35% reduction of the emissions intensity of GDP by 2030 compared to a 2005 baseline. But admittedly, one could say that, well, maybe the nationally determined contributions were not ambitious enough. But it's heartening to see that in both cases, we are likely to significantly exceed our contributions, our NDCs. And I believe that given the pace of progress, by 2030, India's non-fossil share of generating capacity could be as high as 55 to 65%. And India's emissions intensity could reduce to 40 to 50% compared to 2005 instead of 33 to 35%. And given what I spoke about the cost of coal compared to renewables and storage, India could possibly also consider no new coal plants in a decade or so. So these are the kind of ambitious and updated nationally determined contributions that India could possibly consider this year or next year. So I'll conclude by saying that the sectoral and co-benefits-led development-centric approach, this is a phrase from one of Navroze's papers, in fact, has been fairly successful and is very likely to continue. And given the progress that we have made, I think India's NDCs could be significantly more ambitious going forward. Navrose has already covered that we need a coherent climate institutional framework, and I believe this is this software of policy making is what India would likely focus on in this decade. Besides what India can do on the domestic front, in the international front, the focus on climate finance and equity in cumulative emissions budget for India and other developing countries is something that India should focus on in the negotiations this year and going forward. Thank you. Well, I will turn over to Som now.
Yeah, thank you, Shoibal. Let me just I have a few slides which I'd like to share with the audience. Basically what I would like to just quickly talk about is about two issues, which is effectiveness and equity in an international climate agreement. And the first question is, well, why don't we have an effective climate agreement already? As we heard from Tejal, the Paris commitments are not going to take us out of the danger zone, that they're not insufficient to do that, that's clear. And in particular, the high emitting developed countries plus China are going to, emit enough that the 1.5 degree target will be unattainable. So the question is, why is it that there has been a collective failure at the global level? And in my reading, this is essentially due to the domestic politics of most countries. There are three groups that matter in most countries. One is activists who want action to reduce the danger from climate change. Two, fossil fuel owners and employees who want to protect their profits or jobs. And three, the general public that does not pay much attention to climate change. So the role that these three groups play roughly is the activists try to stir up the public and make the public aware of the danger of climate change. Fossil fuel owners try to prevent the public from paying attention to the problem by, intervening in the political process and in the media and so on. And the public, as I said, so far has, in most countries, has not paid too much attention. Most people have lots of things to worry about. And the effect is that fossil fuel owners have so far successfully prevented the public from getting really worried in most countries, with the result that their governments have taken only baby steps to deal with climate change. Now, I think this is going to change in this decade itself, right, in the decade of the 2020s, because as we've already seen accelerating impacts of climate change, and these impacts are becoming more and more obvious. They're no longer things that you have to tease out with sophisticated statistical analyses. They're things that are sort of visible to the naked eye and becoming more and more obvious, more and more extreme events and so on. And the second, trend that is happening is that the value of fossil fuel assets has already started to decline, particularly in coal, but that's also even true in petroleum to some extent already. Right, and then of course this is because the market is anticipating, financial markets are anticipating transition. So when the public in many countries gets really worried, then their governments will be pushed to take strong action. Right? And that strong action will of course include not only domestic actions in each country, but an effective international agreement. So I want to say a little bit about effectiveness and equity. Right? When governments are ready to take strong action, and I believe this is not very far in the future, I think it's likely to happen to a greater and greater degree in the 2020s itself. Okay, but maybe might take a little longer, although I doubt it. When governments are ready to take strong action, how should an international agreement be structured so that it both provides governments with incentives to act and also is equitable? And one question that arises naturally is our effectiveness and equity in conflict? Is there a trade-off between the two? So for an international climate agreement to be effective, it must provide incentives to all country governments to reduce their emissions quickly, faster than they would do otherwise, and eventually also to reduce the carbon stock in the atmosphere. I think it's pretty clear now that given the trajectory that the world is on now, we're going to, by the time emissions reach zero, in a few decades' time, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would have risen to very dangerous levels, and there's going to be a need to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So those are the two things that, of course, are needed for an agreement to be effective. Emissions have to be reduced faster, and when eventually they get to zero, then the stock is going to have to be reduced. So there has to be carbon dioxide removal. And this effectiveness necessitates a future-oriented perspective. And the reason is that we can't change the past, but we do need to motivate actors to change the future so that we have a better future. Now let's turn, that's about effectiveness. Let me turn to notions of equity. And there are, of course, different notions of equity, right? It's not a unidimensional concept. So one of the relevant notions of equity in the climate context is the polluter-based principle. And that basically just says that those who have caused harm should pay for it rather than shifting the burden to others of cleaning up the pollution. If we apply this in the climate context, it implies that countries should be responsible for reducing their own emissions because their own emissions are additions to the stock, and it's the stock that causes the harm of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And countries should pay for reductions to the stock in proportion to their contributions to it. So when we get to the point of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, that's going to be an expensive process. Who's going to pay for that? How should those costs be shared, right? And equity says, well, if you apply the polluter-based principle, then those costs should be shared in proportion to the contributions to the stock. So that implies there is a potential conflict between equity and effectiveness, since contributions to the stock that cause harm have happened in the past, right? We already have a history, and in that history, some countries have contributed much more. The developed countries that industrialized earliest have contributed much more to the stock than countries that didn't industrialize early or haven't yet industrialized to a great degree. So there are other notions of equity, right? For example, a very important and common notion is based on the idea that those with the greater ability to pay should pay more, right? And that's the principle underlying progressive income taxation, which is common everywhere in the world. Okay, so these are two notions of equity that I want to mention here. So how can we incorporate both effectiveness and equity in an agreement? So my proposal is the following, that countries that have low per capita emissions should unite behind a proposal with two components. First component is a scheme that has been proposed by Raghuram Rajan recently, what he calls a global carbon incentive for emissions. Right? And the second component, Shoaib suggested the name GCI plus, to add the second component. I think that carbon dioxide removal, when it occurs at scale, should be paid for in proportion to countries' total contributions to the stock. Okay. So two components, one to do with emissions reductions, the second to do with carbon dioxide removal. Okay, first let me talk about the GCI for emission reduction. What is it exactly? What's the proposal? The proposal is that countries above the global average of per capita emissions pay into a global fund an amount that is proportional to the difference between their per capita emissions and the global average per capita emissions. So that's for countries above the global average. And countries below the global average of per capita emissions will receive payments from this fund in proportion to the difference between the global average per capita emissions and their own per capita emissions. Right? So you can see essentially that whether you are whether you're paying into the fund or you're receiving payments to the fund, either way, the governments of those countries have an incentive to reduce emissions, because that will reduce, if you're above the average, that will reduce the payments you have to make. And if you're below the average, it will increase the payments that you receive, right? So it provides direct incentives for governments to act if it's implemented. The other thing that is just an arithmetic consequence is that it's a budget balance thing. So the amount that gets paid in to the fund is exactly the amount that gets paid out. So let me just give a quick example. For example, let's take China. China emits about 7 tons of CO2 per person annually, compared to a global average of about 5 tons of CO2 per person, right? That's a per capita global average is 5. And if one sets a carbon, price or a rate of $10 per ton of CO2, right? Then China would pay about 7 minus 5, which is 2 times 10 equals $20 per person into the fund annually, right? And that amounts to about 0.2% of China's per capita income, which is about $10,000, okay, at current exchange rates. Let's take a low per capita emitter like Uganda, okay. Uganda has per capita emissions of 0.13 tons of CO2 per person and would receive about 5 minus 0.13, right, which is almost 5, right, into 10, which is $48.7 per person annually, okay? Or about, that amounts to about 6% of Uganda's per capita income of $817 per person, okay? So for Uganda, this is a substantial incentive. It's about 6% of per capita income. That would mean that it's about maybe, considerably larger fraction of the government budget, right? If the government budget is about a fifth of per capita income, then this would be something like, close to 30% of the government budget, right? So it would be a very substantial incentive. So as we can see, because this scheme has the kind of larger, richer countries essentially paying in, for them, the payment is a relatively small fraction of their income. And because it has the relatively poorer countries receiving the payments, for those countries, the payments are a relatively large fraction of their income. Okay. Now, let me talk a little bit more about effectiveness and equity. It's clear that a GCI would provide all governments with incentives to reduce emissions. Right? Notice that a GCI is future-oriented. The formula is based on current and future emissions, right? Because those are the things that you take into account. The amount that a government would have to pay this year, and the amount it would have to pay next year, and so on and so forth. It's not based on past emissions. And it's this feature that provides the incentive for emission reduction. However, it also promotes equity because current emissions are highly, although not perfectly, correlated with past contributions to the stock. There is a link to the polluter-based principle, although it has to be said that this is not a perfect link. For example, if you take the example of the US and China, with their current per capita incomes and current per capita emissions, the US would end up paying into the fund about the same proportion, not very different proportion of its GDP as China would, right? And in some sense, that's unfair because the US's historical contribution to the carbon stock in the atmosphere, and therefore to the damages that are being inflicted on the whole world, are larger than China's contribution. So it doesn't line up that well with the polluter-based principle, right? There is some correlation with it, but of course it's not a perfect lineup because it's based on current emissions and not on the past stock, right? And this is in a sense basically the equity efficiency trade-off, because to provide incentives, you have to make payments, taxes, transfers contingent on what people and governments are going to do, because you want them to change their behavior in the future. But to take equity properly into account, you have to take into account not only what governments are going to do, but also what they did in the past, right? And so that's why the correlation isn't perfect, right? But there is quite a substantial correlation. Okay. Second point is that per capita emissions are also highly correlated with per capita incomes in our world, right? If the richer people are, the more energy they tend to consume, therefore the more carbon dioxide they tend to emit, and that's a fairly high correlation. Okay. So the effect of such a GCI would be that richer countries whose past emissions have done most of the damage from climate change would be making most of the transfers to poorer countries who are suffering more of the damage and have done the least to contribute to the problem. And so there is a good, there's a good measure of equity in that scheme. Okay. Now the question is, why would high per capita emission countries join an agreement with the GCI, even after their domestic politics had changed enough to impart urgency to solving the climate problem? And the answer is, well, perhaps they wouldn't. If there were an alternative that would persuade low emission countries to reduce their emissions, right? One such alternative that we can already see developed countries thinking about is trade sanctions. And if large, relatively rich emitters got together, that might be a possibility. And it would be, of course, deeply unfair, right? It would also be less likely, however, to provide sufficient incentives for low emission countries to reverse emissions growth, right? Because the truth of the matter is that sticks don't work very well in these kinds of situations. You really need the carrots, because you need, poorer countries to have the capacity and the financial resources to be able to get the job done, right? So it would perhaps be self-defeating on the part of the rich countries to be too hard-nosed about this. And that's a good reason for low emission countries to stand united in proposing a GCI, because if they were to be united, then it would be very difficult for rich countries to try and achieve the same result without providing financial assistance. Some modifications to this scheme could be negotiated. I don't want to go into that since we're running out of time. The second component of my proposal is to agree to cost sharing and carbon dioxide removal in proportion to the contribution of each country to the carbon stock in the atmosphere. And that's also important both for equity and for effectiveness, right? It's obviously important for equity because it's based on, how much the polluter paid, how much the polluter emitted is proportional to how much they would pay. But it's also important to give every country an additional incentive to avoid adding to the stock of CO2 in the meantime. So if that's written into the agreement today, then looking forward, every country knows that every ton that it emits, in the future is a ton that it is potentially liable to pay to remove, right? So it gives an additional incentive to reduce emissions quickly, right? And the urgency of the problem is so great that that's important, okay? So this is my last thing I wanted to say. When governments do get serious, when domestic politics in various countries permits, then it will be possible to negotiate an agreement in which all countries agree to take much stronger action.
And on to something like this, given that they have been
in different countries, of course, at different times. And when that happens, then countries are going to get much more serious about emission reduction domestically. And also they will be looking around to make sure that other countries are doing the same. And so I think that the level of seriousness is one big thing. The second thing is that with this GCI scheme, right, the payments are automatically tied to emission reductions in some sense. I mean, not or not. Because if they don't present a
Same thing true in Norway, considered to be a role model by many European countries. It is climate neutral by 2030, but it is issuing oil and gas exploration permits both in North Sea and the Arctic. Okay, so the contradictions are amazing. And just today, Australia pledged net zero by 2050 with no plans to reduce coal exports. And the global media wants to know when India will announce net zero. To me, India is being honest in admitting we cannot announce net zero at present because the situation is that countries around net zero are not really taking it seriously, and they are continuing various actions which will increase CO2. So I think this issue has to be raised in COP26 in various ways so that this net zero mirage is removed, because this is the way in which many countries are trying to escape their responsibility. Now, this is quite clearly seen in the IPCC report recently. It shows that already between what is promised under the various countries' NDCs and what is required, there's a huge gap. This is what they call the production gap. So unless this is brought down, net zero has no meaning. And that's why Tejal talked about the need for front loading. Now, one problem India has had all along is that the global media has always looked upon India as somehow being obstructionist. This happened during Paris also. It will happen in COP26. And this to me is ridiculous because a country, let me just proceed further and point out why that is so. Developed countries keep asking India to follow low carbon path. To me, this is absolutely hypocritical because the per capita emission of India is one of the lowest in the world. It has the lowest meat consumption, which contributes a lot to CO2 emission, lowest per capita energy consumption, and lowest per capita carbon emission. So a country like this cannot be asked to do low carbon path. We are already on low carbon path. Our only problem is our population is very high, for which we can hold our ancestors responsible, but not the present generation. Okay. Now, the other point is, in the last 10 years, there have been various diversity tactics, including talking about co-benefits of reducing air pollution and global warming. This is absolutely irrelevant tactic because if India and China desire to reduce air pollution, which they should because they cause a large amount of deaths, then the global warming will go up dramatically. This particular figure shows what would have been the global temperature today if aerosols were not injected during the growth in the last 100 years. It would have been more like 1.7 or 1.8 already. It's because of the sulfate aerosol emitted during burning that we are around 1.2, 1.3. Okay? So if India and China decide for their own good to cut down air pollution, then it will be a serious issue in the near term because the global warming will accelerate. So that cannot be an issue. Now, this is based on one model. You may not believe it. I'll give you a recent paper which compared 4 different models. All of them say that if you suddenly reduce the air pollution and reduce aerosol emissions from combustion, the temperature will rise anywhere between 0.5 to 1 degree centigrade. Okay? And the mean of that is around 1. And so this is a thing which should be now not even talked about. Controlling local air pollution and global warming are 2 separate issues. They cannot be mixed up. And as a matter of fact, if India and China decide to reduce air pollution, this could also be mentioned. This also can be told about developed world. They are enjoying a very high level of standard of living because of use of fossil fuels, and they don't want anything to change right now. They think that they can tackle climate change because of their higher wealth that they have. Okay. Now, let me say, it's not an easy problem. This was pointed out more than 40 years ago. This is called a wicked problem because society response everywhere, both developed and developing, are full of avoidance and denial. We don't want to believe that we human beings are affecting the climate of the earth. And there is no change in behavioral response until there's a crisis. And the ethical issue of we taking away the future generations' ability to develop is very difficult to convince most people. So this is the dilemma here, how to convince people both in developed world, developing world, on a problem which is both long-term and in which the serious crisis is just beginning to emerge. And in the case of Montreal Protocol, they were able to coin a wonderful word, ozone hole. And that resonated well, both among the leaders and among the public. And everybody wanted to make sure that hole is healed. And we are trying to find a similar wordsmithing to convince both the leaders and the public that we are facing a very serious problem. Okay, I think I'll stop here and thank all the people presented their views very clearly. And I think I would like the audience now to respond, to ask questions. Shoaib, can you take over?
Thank you, Jayesh, for your comments. Yes.
Can I say something?
Sure, go ahead.
So I just had a couple of comments, with regards to discussion with the GCI. The question is, when is this going to happen? If you're waiting for countries to arrive at a situation when they are willing to take strong action domestically, and developed countries are already using stakes. It's not as if they aren't. Through multilateral agencies, development banks, there are, in fact, much more stringent, in fact, funding for fossil fuel projects is being stopped everywhere, and the first projects being stopped are the poorest countries. So this is already happening. And so if we are envisaging something like the GPI, the question is, when do we think something like this would kick in? And this is a sort of a variant on the contract and convergence approach that of an earlier era, but with emissions, with the money, with the price attached to those emission reductions, of course. But how does it fit in with the science as we know today, in terms of what does it mean for the total stock of emissions that this would result in whenever we arrive at a convergence, when those who are paying in and those who get paid, in fact, converge at a point? What would the total emissions be at that point of time? How do we sort of ensure that this trajectory is going to zero is not very clear with this kind of an approach. And so perhaps some discussion on that is necessary. Secondly, I think just one more thing to Shoaib on, and even Navroz, really, because we are talking about enhancing ambition and what in what way can India perhaps enhance the ambition. One of the things that would, in my opinion, result in is, of course, if you commit to do more today, 4 years from now, when you're actually required to commit more, there's going to be demands for even more. And what this means, however, is that we are promising away the fair share of a carbon budget as a gift to developed countries, and we are riding on the global commons. We are validating their appropriation of the global commons. So while it is possible for India, perhaps with businesses and what is now called stated policy scenarios, so you already have policies that will lead to enhanced more action than we have planned for now, then if we do that without saying, however, that what we free up as space is not going to be available for developed countries. It will be available for us for the future if in case we need it, if things don't go as planned. For example, battery costs don't reduce as rapidly as we think, or the grid doesn't react as we anticipate to higher amount of renewable energy. Say Make in India actually happens, and we have much higher growth in industry. What are we going to do in such situations where those trajectories are dynamically different. So to be able to protect our interests for the future, even as we do what we can do in terms of what is reasonably affordable for us. So I just wanted to flag those two questions. Thank you.
Shoaib, can I come in?
Yeah, go ahead. No problem.
Okay, so two things. One on the GCI and so on. My observations. It's a very sort of neat idea. And Som did a great job of kind of laying out how it's the incentives are all lined up in the way that one would want. My concerns about making that kind of a central plank are really twofold. One is somewhat akin to what Tejal said, is kind of the time and sequencing point, right? I think there's an awful lot that has to happen now, which has to be incentivized. And in a sense, we can't really wait for the political conditions to be aligned for that sort of global cooperation to happen. This decade really is quite critical from a climate change point of view. But the second part of it is that increasingly there's literature that basically says, look, obviously carbon prices play a role. And I don't know, I'm sure Som does, what the estimates are of what the carbon price, I mean, what are we talking about in terms of actually a global carbon price through the GCI? Obviously, it depends on what the contributions are across different countries. But prices are only a part of the story, and you need to have packages of policies that also try and accelerate the decline of fossil fuels. You need to have compensatory policies for social actors. Some of these are about finances, others are not. Many of them are about dealing with transaction costs. Arguably, the biggest issue in dealing with renewable energy in India is the fate of the discoms. One of the biggest issues with coal is the cross-subsidy from railways, the linkage with the public sector banks who are overinvested in coal plants. None of these things are really going to be untangled by a price signal alone. So I think we have to be cautious. So this can be a piece, a part of the solution. It's worth keeping on the table, but I don't think we should be approaching. I think the silver bullet overtones to the conversation of what worry me. It's complicated, not just politically, but also in terms of transition dynamics. So I think we shouldn't try and reduce this in ways that actually might be unhelpful, and certainly keep it sort of part of the conversation. The second, so that's on the GCI. On Tejal's point, I think, look, the world, where the conversation, I think, has shifted on all the fair share stuff is that maybe 10 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, you could say that there was, if not a one-to-one correlation, a very strong correlation between the necessity of increased energy needs and making sure we had access to the ability to emit carbon as a way of meeting those energy needs. Now that linkage is much weaker with renewable energy prices. It's also the case that, and it's not my case certainly, that co-benefits are ubiquitous, but they are highly prevalent in many cases. And I also think that even with the air pollution story, Professor Srinivasan is of course right about the aerosol story, but if you reduce it at source, then they are mutually reinforcing. So the co-benefit story is not a simple story, but it is a story that allows a lot of action to happen domestically. So in that context, I think the way Tejal put it later on in her question is the way I would agree with it, is that we need to actually think about carbon as a hedge. It may be necessary, it may not be that necessary, we don't know. So we shouldn't be put into a situation where if we need to burn the carbon, we don't have access to it. I completely agree with that. But I'm not sure that that translates to arguments for a fair share. Because a fair share basically says here's a calculation we're making based on some somewhat abstract determination of how you slice up the pie. And of the authors on this call, at least 3 of us have been a part of papers that try and slice up that pie in very different ways, just on this call, right? Shoaib has one, Tejal has one, and I'm a latecomer to this party, piggybacking on some people who are much more technically skilled than I am. And so I'm sure you have a version of this too, actually. So that fair share story, we're not going to get agreement on it. So we need, so I think the way to think about it is, how do we make sure we have this as an insurance policy while not building a negotiating strategy around trying to nail down right to a resource that we may not use, and that frankly, if we do use all of it in 20 or 30 years, we will be a technologically backward country. Because if we are using all the carbon that Tejal thinks we have a fair share to in 2040, the world will have moved on technologically. So I think we need a more nuanced view, which doesn't mean you throw equity out of the window at all, but we need a more nuanced view on how we engage equity in this conversation.
Can I just maybe can I just respond very quickly? So I think you misunderstood what I was saying about a carbon price. So there is no implication here that countries would have carbon prices internally. They can have whatever kinds of policies they want. Those may or may not include carbon prices. It's just a way of incentivizing all countries, country governments, not firms and individuals and farmers and so on, but country governments to enact policies which would reduce emissions, right? And to do it in a way which is, more equitable rather than less equitable. So that's point one. But I think the larger point I want to make is that I think that the conversation, particularly in India, about climate agreements is very unfortunately too India-centric. I think that India is going to make no headway and is going to be completely outmaneuvered in international climate negotiations unless it has a large set of allies. But in order to get a large set of allies, you have to have some kind of organizing principle which will appeal to a large set of allies, right? If all your arguments are kind of very ad hoc in nature, right, then you're just not going to get them. Secondly, they have to be not only appeal to an organizing principle which will get a lot of allies, but at the end of the day, right, people have to believe that this is going to ultimately result in an agreement. It's not just going to be, a position that goes nowhere. So we have to have both components. We need an organizing principle around to build an alliance, a large alliance. Otherwise, we're going to, we are not in a strong position. Let's be clear about that. We're in a very weak position because we're very vulnerable and we really can't do much about it on our own. We need the big emitters to act. Right? So we need those allies because otherwise things are not going to go our way. The second thing is that not only do we need allies, but the principle around which we get those allies has to be constructive enough that it ultimately gets the large emitters to at least come halfway towards our position. So I think that's really the critical thing. It's not so much the details of the incentive or so on. I think it's a good idea, but one can argue about that. But I think the larger thing is really one needs organizing principles that appeal to a broad group.
Which has the carbon tax on petrol and diesel, or just the high cost of petrol and diesel, deterred its consumption? And do we know that? Well, actually, that's difficult to say. I think the point I was trying to make was that the high cost of petrol and diesel makes EVs, especially two-wheeler and three-wheeler EVs, much more attractive. So, and I think it advances their intake by quite a few years. I think, and that's, I believe, is the sort of incidental impact of of the high cost of petrol and diesel. And I think this also, in some sense, partly answers the question that Tejal had, which is, should India make more commitments? Well, it just boils down to this. If renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy, then we will definitely, just from the economical point of view, use more renewable energy. And that is in some sense what India is doing right now. And so, well, yes, please.
Can I comment on the costs? Because this has been said quite a few times. If renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy. If you're talking about gas energy, coal, of course, and let's not get into the unaccounted for costs of coal, but just the physical production cost also, okay, that could be cheaper. But this estimate does not include balancing costs. It does not include grid integration costs, which are equivalent to variable costs of some coal plant. The estimates of 2020 that they are equivalent. And what about storage costs, and how much do we expect these to come down over a period of time? This is in no way to say that that costs of renewable energy are not reducing, and so therefore we have reason to be much more optimistic about what renewable energy can do and the role that it can play in the future than we had 10 years ago and 15 years ago. There's no doubt about that, and then there is no doubt that this is going to play a larger role proportionately as we go. The point is how much larger, how soon, at what, and this goes back to what Navroz had flagged in his presentation about this balance between R&D, research and development, and manufacturing versus deployment, and making sure, because while I said that we are gifting our fair share to the developed countries, we will be gifting more than just the fair share of the carbon space. We are heavily import dependent for a lot of renewable energy technologies. So this also is an added dimension that we must think about. So at what rate do we enhance those targets? And just to say that the argument for fair share, when 10 years back, 15 years back, when we were talking about it, we were talking about it as an architecture for a climate agreement, which included some consensus on fair shares across countries. Here we are talking about staking a claim, which South Africa has done already in its first NDC. It is not the same India doing it, because it's a much bigger number when you stake a claim to your fair share. But it can be accompanied by various conditionality. You're not forcing anyone else to accept their fair share, but how do you hedge, or how do you preserve your right to that carbon space unless you stake a claim? And if a country the size of India with our emissions does it, I believe that it is likely to be a game changer, at least sort of a spoke in the wheel of the net zero narrative, where the conversation moves back to the science where it really actually should be. Yeah, so I mean, sorry to move here from the costs again, but perhaps a little more discussion on what we mean, what are the comparative costs between which coal and which renewable energy at what year, with storage, without storage, with balancing, without balancing, perhaps is, would add some value to the discussion.
I think the analysis that we did account for all of these, and despite that, it did come out that by the end of this decade, it would be quite close. Yeah.
Shoaib, can I add something?
Sure.
One thing about India people have not discussed is that wind energy in India is actually very poor. We have managed to have a large installed capacity, but wind is there only for 4 months a year during monsoon. Rest of the time it is not there. This is not true of China, Europe, and America. They live in a different latitude. They have a huge advantage. And United Kingdom has gone completely to wind because they have wind throughout the year. So India has a very serious problem, is that our wind energy exploitation can only be during monsoon. and we have to depend mostly on solar, and solar is not there at night. Now, the demand for power does not go to zero at night because of industries. So that issue has to be tackled in a very big way, because imagine in a non-monsoon month during night when industries have to work, what kind of storage capacity we need? It's a huge one, right? And has anybody looked at that? What kind of capacity you need between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. When the wind is not contributing much, except a little bit of hydro, I suppose. So this is, India has a unique problem which should be highlighted. We are different from China and different from all the countries in mid-latitudes.
That's true. India will likely have the highest demand for storage if we turn towards renewables.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have far exceeded our time budget here. Would any of the panelists want to say something more? Any finishing remarks? Professor J.S.?
No, I think I have said enough.
Thank you all very much for this wonderful conversation, and I hope we can extract some highlights on and some understanding on what India should do going forward. It's a very tricky problem, and it's a very wicked problem, as Jay said, and I hope this conversation helps us out. Thank you very much.
Okay, I thank all the panelists for giving a good presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.